Welcome again to our audiences, both in presence and online, and welcome to this MPC seminar of this month. My name is Leila Giannetto, and I'm a research fellow here at MPC. And today our speaker is Lorenzo Piccoli, also a research fellow at MPC. Lorenzo is also leading the teaching curriculum here at the MPC and at the Transnational School of Governance. And today is going to present his paper on the nexus between migration and mobility, and specifically a framework to understand the interplay between different ideal types of human development. So a few housekeeping rules. Lorenzo's presentation is going to be around 20 minutes, and then I'll open the floor for questions, both online and in presence. For the people in the room, just remember to turn on your mic when you speak. And for the people online, please use the chat box to put your questions or raise your hand if you want to address directly our Lorenzo. Without further ado, Lorenzo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. There is an Italian song written by Giorgio Gaber, I think, that is entitled "What is the right and what is the left ideologically?" And the answer is those are categories of the mind. And I think this paper could have a similar title, because in the paper we ask what is migration really and what is mobility. And I'm using the plural because I am presenting today, but actually this is a paper I've wrote together with other people. We are a group of, I think, 8 or maybe even 9 co-authors. The co-authors, you can see them on this slide, are Matteo Gianni, Didier Rodin, Christine Ackermann, Janinda Hinden, Paola Hofmeier-Zotlik, Mihaela Nedelko, Tanya Zittun, and if there is any credit for the paper and the presentation that you're going to listen in the next few minutes, the credit is shared. If there is any problem or mistake, the fault is only mine. I have to say this paper, this piece of work has been produced over a very long period of time, working together with the community of the NCCR on the Move, the National Center for Competence in Research on Migration and Mobility in Switzerland. We are happy that it has finally been published. So you can read the paper already on a journal that is called Sociology. And because the paper has been published already, I decided to use this presentation to try and do a bit of a brainstorming with you and also make a very playful presentation, trying to use a lot of visual support. Before we get to that, so the question, what is migration? What is mobility? I think it's born out of a bit of a frustration with the way in which these terms are oftentimes used, but probably meaning very different things for different people. I'm going to give you just a few examples in different fields where we work. So, for example, research centers. At Sciences Po Paris, there is a cluster of work on migration, diversity, and mobility. Another very famous research center in New York is the Zollberg Center on Migration and Mobility. And then there are plenty other examples, but maybe one more, the interdisciplinary migration and mobility cluster at Monash University in Malaysia. In these cases, it is not clear to me and to the co-authors whether migration and mobility, they mean the same thing, or they are in the title because they are different, they mutually reinforce each other, or they are complementary. And the similar impression we have by reading important books and papers in the discipline. So, for example, a very famous book written, among others, by Andrew, who is in the room, is entitled Migration and Mobility in the European Union, by analyzing these two different phenomena in the book. If you take what for many of us is a very important reference, the World Migration Report by IOM, in the last edition, there was one chapter which is entitled Providing Perspective on Migration and on Mobility in increasingly uncertain times. So again, an idea that there is a difference between migration and mobility. And then I think this is a paper written by Alan Gamlen, again, migration and mobility after the 2020 pandemic. Many of the people online are involved in international organizations, public administrations, and even there, the terms migration and mobility are often used in conjunction. I'm just going to give you one example of an important document produced by the European Commission in 2011 to address actually different issues, including smuggling, but also labor mobility. And the document was entitled The Global Approach on, again, Migration and Mobility. So we really wanted to try and break down those different meanings that the terms can have, because our intuition is that behind those different terms, there are very powerful normative underpinnings or representations of what kind of human movement is desirable or not desirable, and maybe tapping on some research that Friedrich is doing in this room, what type of movement is essential, what type of movement is not essential, what type of movement should be encouraged, and what type of movement should be disencouraged. And the reason why we think a new contribution on this topic could be useful is because research on those two broad categories, again, has developed in isolation from each other. So many of us in this room, I think, come from a perspective of migration studies that have developed over the last 30 years with a lot of journals in the discipline and a strong focus on human movements that crosses national borders. And now, of course, there are several problems with this approach or limitations. The first one is that these focus on specific forms on human movement naturalizes borders, the national order of things. There is a very important contribution by Adrian Favell showing how many of us, if we look at the border in Tijuana, for example, focus on irregular crossings exclusively, but there is just a lot more movement going on. Tourists, truck drivers, students, people who cross the border for shopping, but we don't see it because we just focus on a specific type of movement that we call migration. This also comes with the consequence that this approach sometimes reproduces the legacies of colonialism that created and fixed national borders. And finally, there is a very narrow understanding on what type of human movement deserves to be studied. To counter those limitations over the last 20 years, it has emerged a different approach that has been called the mobility turn. So an important focus on categories of mobility that are not necessarily those of migration. But this approach also has important limitations. One thing I really struggled with when I was trying to create a dialogue with people who use the approach of mobility is that, to be quite blunt, I do not understand what mobility is and where migration stops and mobility begins. I could never find a workable definition of human mobility that allows me to understand whether my commuting from home to here should be considered mobility or not, and whether my moving from this room to my office can also be considered a form of mobility or not. More importantly, I think there is also a normatively charged view of mobility as something that is considered to be desirable and something that should be incentivized. But very often mobility in the times that we live is a privilege of some people only. And it does reproduce inequalities, for example, of class, but also of gender and race. What we contend in this paper is that these two approaches have important benefits, but they should try to talk to each other a bit more than they do, as a way of getting over those important limitations. So rather than trying to find the third way or something completely new, our invitation is to try and cross-fertilize a bit more these categories as a way of, on the one hand, expose the cognitive framing of labeling migrants as very special human beings that are different from others, but at the same time to remain attentive of how important political and social norms can be in creating borders and distributing rights that are very consequential. And to do that, we propose an approach that we call the migration mobility nexus. If you want to visualize the migration mobility nexus, it can really be like a pair of glasses that you wear when you write, when you do research on these topics. And the migration mobility nexus essentially postulates that rather than focusing on migration or categories of migration as such, or on categories of mobility, we should always try to remain attentive of the interplay that there is between these two categories, regardless of the way in which we use them in our research, in our work. So this is really an invitation to pay attention to the different type of relationships that can emerge from using categories of migration and categories of mobility in conjunction. And we think this is important and could be useful to understand the kind of incentives of privileges or penalties of sanctions that are applied as a result of those interplays. Now, this is where I move from a very abstract discussion to something a bit more specific. And again, I use a lot of visual supports, and I hope I am paying justice to actually the photographers who took the pictures that I'm going to use. We did identify 4 interplays between categories of migration and categories of mobility that, again, we think reflect very different ways of thinking about those categories. And I'm going to propose them to you in the next few minutes. This is also an invitation for you to try and consider whether those interplays make sense for you, whether you identify with one or more of those, and whether you can think of other forms of interplay between these. So the first interplay between categories of migration and categories of mobility, we call it a continuum. And this is born out of the idea that migration and mobility are on a spectrum of different experiences of human movement. And they change qualitatively, essentially. On the one hand, you have a long-term move, normally of a longer distance, normally quite permanent, that we tend to call migration. On the other end of the spectrum, you have shorter terms, probably more frequent and probably faster movements that most people call mobility. And of course, you do have a lot of different statuses in between. So people who look at the interplay between migration and mobility through these interplay, they tend to observe human movement in terms of speed, distance, frequency, and time that is used for specific movements. And I thought of those 2 pictures as representing quite well these interplay, pictures taken by very famous photographers who are, of course, credited at the end of the presentation. Now, this is a completely different way of thinking about the interplay between categories of migration and categories of mobility from what we call enablement. Enablement is a form of thinking about migration as something that can be accessed only through mobility. And at the same time, mobility can further lead to migration. Using this interplay means that people pay a lot more attention to individuals as agents who navigate different opportunities and different constraints. And here maybe one example of research that uses this form of interplay is the research on opera singers coming from former Soviet republics who use marriages with Italian nationals, in this case, strategically to access a migration status to become Italians. And then that is only a prerequisite to be able to move across European Union countries. It's a very neat example, I think, of how you can use migration to achieve more mobility. Similar research on how people naturalize into, for example, Swiss nationality to then be able to travel globally with fewer limitations. This research, I should mention, is by Irina Isakian, who used to be at the European University Institute and now works in Canada. So you see already two very different ways of thinking about how migration and mobility interact, which in turn shows different ways of thinking about migration and mobility. Now, a different interplay, which I would dare to say is probably the one that is most commonly used by the people in this room, is hierarchy. And here the focus is not so much on the qualitative nature of human movement. It is not on individuals as agents who navigate rules, but it's on the process of rule making. And so the drivers of migration policies, for example, and their consequences on people as a form of creating hierarchies of rights, hierarchies of duties and obligations, and oftentimes also studying how those hierarchies are in turn a reflection of class, gender, race, and other individual factors. Again, the two pictures in this I chose for this slide. I hope they represent this approach quite neatly. One is a picture, of course, of asylum seekers, refugees being rescued in the sea. And the other picture is a picture by a famous project on mobility around the world with photos taken in airports and train stations. The fourth interplay that we identify, again, a slightly different focus, and I have to admit, in my view, the probably least developed of the four interplays that we have. We call it opposition, and here the idea is that migration and mobility are co-constitutive of each other, but they clash. So unlike enablement, where also you can see an interaction between the two, in this case, you can think of the mobility of people as a form of resisting, for example, migration norms and migration regimes. One example would be the mobility of people who are in an irregular status to escape or to evade from deportation. In here, like enablement, the focus of this interplay lies on individual agency and how individuals use their agency to counter migration policies, and mobility can be part of those of that repertoire of strategies. Okay, so those are some examples of interplays between categories of migration and categories of mobility that we hope show how, again, people think very differently about those two very broad phenomena. And you can see this by thinking about the focus of observation. In the first case, it's really on the experience of movement. For enablement, is more on the social networks, on the resources that people can use, social capital, their connections, and also on the capabilities. If we think of the interplay as one of hierarchy, we would probably think of regimes or rule making and the making of boundaries, both territorial and membership boundaries. And if the interplay that we are most interested in is opposition, then we really think again about individual agency, but most in the way of human experiences, biographies, and life courses. And the core message that comes out of each of those four interplays is very different. In the first interplay, we see migration and mobility as part of a same phenomenon and just a qualitative difference between the two. But if we think of enablement and opposition, for example, migration and mobility are completely different phenomena that can nurture each other, but have a very different ontology. Of course, this is mainly an invitation for other people to further develop the interplays that we have proposed, add more interplays, and also expand a bit the scope of this research, because of course, all of us as we put very candidly in this slide, are based in Western European countries, and it would be crucial to try and think of whether these interplays can also fly and apply in other regional contexts, and whether there are other types of interplay that would come out from different regions of the world. And finally, and this is the very last point I want to make, as we were working on this, we realized that we were only capturing experiences of human movement, and we were cutting off completely people who are not able to move. So for the future, something that we could do, or other people could do, is try to think of how immobility would fit into this framework, and whether this would lead to additional interplays. But I will stop here. Thanks a lot for bearing with me, and I'm very happy to receive questions from you, but even more so, maybe comments, since the paper is already out, and you can access it by using the QR code on this slide. And I'm very receptive to your criticisms and suggestions. Thank you.
Thanks, Lorenzo. Thank you for this thought-provoking presentation. I'm opening now the floor for questions, both in the room and online, if anyone wants to break the ice. Yes, Martin, please. Can you please also introduce yourself briefly? Thank you.
Yes, I'm Martin Rus. I'm based here at the Migration Policy Center. Thanks, Lorenzo. I took a brief look at the paper before coming. I haven't read it in detail, so apologies for that. But I suppose my question is a very basic one. I mean, the way I think about this is mainly about, in terms of, there's a big debate how you define a migrant and migration. I suppose, I mean, isn't that, I mean, a basic point to make is that, I mean, these are all terms we use, and we give particular meanings to those terms. So different people could define these things very differently. So there's a debate, is it, are we talking about foreign nationals, foreign-born, recent arrivals? And so with this as well, people mean different things, and they use it for framing, and politicians use it in different ways. EU policymakers like to talk about mobile EU citizens. Statisticians describe the same people as migrants. So my question is, I mean, given that these things are to some extent always, I'm not sure if socially constructed is the right word, but they are constructed in the sense that it entirely depends on how you define them, and there's no one right definition. So given that, how are you going to study the interplay between two things that different people define very differently?
If there are more questions, I can collect them now. Or yes, Claire.
Thanks so much, Lorenzo. That was very interesting. I had a brief glance at the paper as well. Didn't read it in full detail. I suppose one of my questions in looking at the paper was, when you're talking about typologies and you've got these 4 categories: continuum, enablement, hierarchy, and opposition, in what sense were you thinking of them as types? I mean, is it really the kind of the Weberian ideal type, and how are they ideals? And maybe you could say a little more about that. And then when you were presenting, I suppose it struck me that there are examples, you talked about different parts of the world, and some of these interplays made me think, what about examples of Irish travelers, for example, or the traveling communities in other parts of Europe, the Roma? And how do you see that fitting within these typologies as you've described them? And, again, I would sort of interrogate what you mean by typology in the sense of ideal type or not, and how do you see real examples fitting within this model? Thank you.
Maybe one more, Beth? Yes.
Hi, Lorenzo. I thought the paper was really interesting in your presentation. What really fascinated me was, as you pointed out, there are several academic institutions who call their institutions institutions of migration and mobility. And I wonder what you think the reason is that they do that. Because, if it's unclear, why would they choose that name? I mean, in my experience, I worked for an organization that really first called it immigration, then called it mobility, and then came to migration. So that was the trajectory that I had been used to in terms of that. But I just wondered, from your point of view, why they would keep those two terms, or why they would only turn to one term. So,
Lorenzo.
Yeah, thanks for these questions. I'll try to answer them all. Martin, we struggled a lot with, so I was very happy you didn't ask the question that I always got when I was presenting this paper as I was writing it, but you asked a slightly different question. So normally people ask me, how do you define migration and how do you define mobility? And my answer was that we do not define those in the paper, because what we want to do is precisely to allow people to use very different definitions, which is totally fair because it reflects different ontologies and different interests and different priorities. But the invitation is to always try to be clear about what you mean when you are writing a policy report or a paper about migration, what you mean by mobility, and how these two interact, which in my opinion is oftentimes overlooked. Which brings me to Beth's question. It is oftentimes overlooked. I don't know exactly why. If I were to speculate on this, my impression is that mobility is a much less political term, it's less controversial, and migration is more. So oftentimes I've been thinking that mobility is used also to soften maybe more controversial debates, but I have no idea whether that's really the case. And I want to say I'm hoping I'm not being recorded here, but clearly I am. So anyways, that's too late. On Claire, no, we do not think of those ideal types as Weberian ideal types. We try to use them as ways in which different people can try to fit their work. And I think, for example, Irish travelers or nomads or even gypsies can fit into those categories. We do have a few references to them. For example, if you think of hierarchy and how different norms are sometimes created to give to include specific mobile populations and exclude others. Sometimes even in paradoxical ways. So I think there is a nice example from Switzerland, because most of the co-authors are based in Switzerland. An example we make in the paper, that of school curricula for foreign kids in Swiss schools. And they are designed to meet the needs of children who are the children of migrants, which is great, of course, and totally fine. But those curricula, they completely disregard children who are the children of people who are in Switzerland maybe only for 1 year, who many people would normally refer to as expats. So sometimes there are also unexpected ways in which those hierarchies can play out. And I think including, again, those very different groups of mobile populations, including travelers, would be precisely what we expect people to do with this framework. Very partial answer to your question.
Thanks, Lorenzo. If someone else has a question from the room, yes. So Friedrich, Andrew, and
Hello, I'm Friedrich. I'm also now based at the Migration Policy Center at the same time at URAC in URAC Research in Bolzano. Thanks for the presentation. Yes, this is a tricky topic, so I'm not surprised that you spent years discussing it, it seems. You just mentioned that the time horizon, that somebody comes to Switzerland for 1 year only. So I wondered to what extent you considered the time horizon as a way to distinguish these things, and whether or not you found it workable. And second, a related question is, if somebody came from you, like from statistics, where they have to sort of come down on one side, you know, when they want, say, statistics on migration, what do you have in there and what do you not have in there? And so people there talk a lot about temporary versus permanent migration, but they definitely don't agree on what is what. And it's very tricky, it gets very technical. To just sum it up in one sentence, the UN says everything above 1 year is migration. And OECD says everything that that gives you the option to renew your status until you stay forever, basically, is migration. So it's really tricky, but I wonder whether you would sort of have anything to say to them where you would come down on that debate.
Andrew.
So I wanted to ask just about discipline. This is in sociology. I wonder about the international relations of this and how that fits within your typology, the bilateral, multilateral relationships between states, migration diplomacy, the development of, say, labor export models in parts of the world, which are very important forms of whatever you would call it. How would you characterize the kind of international relations of this framework you're developing? Where does it fit? And also just maybe you referred to the global approach to migration mobility. In 2007, it was called the global approach to migration. So there's probably a story there. There's a kind of temporality here as well, because it seems that your framework shifts over time. And I suspect that's because of kind of political contestation. Because now in the European Commission, it's skills and talents and partnerships. I don't talk about, as a way to just finesse the debate and try to maybe depoliticize. So just a couple of observations.
Then Julia and Guido.
Hi, thank you. I'm Julia. I'm a Max Weber Fellow here at the MPC. Thanks for the presentation. My question is rather technical, so I wanted to ask you, because together with migration and mobility, you also use the word movement, and I wanted to understand if for you it's just a synonym that you use to kind of replace the migration and mobility, or it's something more, some way to overcome actually this duality, this hierarchy between two terms, and this colonial approach where we name people differently. Thanks.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Hiro, another Max Weber Fellow at MPC, and thank you for a very interesting presentation. And my question is actually overlap with Martin and the Claire's point a little bit, but I'm still kind of struggling to understand what this framework or ideal types exactly represent. So this is what, because in the title is ideal types of the human movement, but migration is basically in the dictionary, it's exactly about the movement, but the mobility is more kind of, in my understanding, is the ability to move or be moved. So it's kind of the vector causing the migration. So it's kind of a different thing. And I'm a little bit wondering what this framework exactly represents. So it sounds to me more like it's the ideal types of the existing discourse or literature or scholarly understanding. It depends on which field. I mean, you are from just maybe sociology. I'm more in the political scientist, so it's totally different. But so this is one question. And the another question is, you presented basically the 4 ideal types, and I was wondering if this 4 type is kind of the comprehensive for all the types, or is there any other possibility you can extend for your future work? Maybe.
Thank you, Lorenzo. This round, this stuff.
Yeah, on the previous round, I was more idealistic and I said I was going to answer them all. Now I'm going to be realistic and say I'm not going to answer them all. But thanks for excellent questions and comments. Friedrich, yeah, tricky topic. The way you talk about statistics really makes me think of the first interplay continuum. So again, the element of time that is used to create a clear-cut distinction between what counts as migration and what does not count as migration and is something else. Maybe just mobility. It's a very different way, again, of thinking about these 2 categories from what Andrew mentioned. So when we think of international trade, for example, and bilateral relations and how that can be linked to certain aspects of migration, we can think of the engagement between different European countries and different African countries recently. I would think of this as the interplay that we call hierarchy. So the creation again of categories that, for right or wrong reasons, here we don't want to go into that, should have specific incentives to move, to cross borders, and to access specific rights and protections. And yes, indeed, on the global approach to migration, I think this would be an amazing way of using this framework and try to see how, because mobility had a certain meaning and it was imbued with connotations, first it was part of the picture, and then it was taken out, and what the politics behind it was, because I think this shows how important labels and categories can be in those political discussions. And Julia and Hiro, I think similar question from a different angle. We think of human movement as the encompassing phenomena. So human movement is what we all do in different ways. And then because of, again, our work as academics, policymakers, practitioners, we define some forms of human movement as migration, and we define other forms of human movement as mobility. Why is it so, and what is the difference? This is what the kind of discussion we try to prompt in this paper. So here, human movement, we think of it as comprehensive, and we do not think of mobility only as the ability to move. Of course, different people can have very different definitions of mobility, again, but we think of it as a specific form of human movement that for some is considered worth of attention, either because we want to write a paper on the mobility of lorry drivers during the pandemic, or because we want to pass new legislation on people who have the right to move within the European Union and should not be called migrants, but should be called mobile European citizens.
Thanks, Lorenzo, for trying. It was a really good try. Now I'm looking at the people online, and then I'll go back to the room. So Leo and Ettore and Kunmi, if you want to intervene directly, just unmute yourselves. Or otherwise, okay.
Hi, Sarah, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Great, thank you so much for the paper. It's really interesting. My question is, I guess it's also linked to the next question from Ettore, but I was wondering if you had identified any of the trends in the use of these interplays, for example, along disciplines. And I realized just after I read the next question that I completely kind of considered that your, I guess, content of analysis was only academic discourse, but maybe it isn't. So thank you.
And then Ettore?
Hi, everybody. How are you doing? I read the paper and enjoyed it a long time ago before it was published, and I'm very glad that it was eventually published. I don't remember whether I posed this question to you before. Maybe I did, but yeah, listening to the presentation today, I'm still struggling with the same issue. I mean, you do an excellent job in mapping the use of the two terms together and how they relate to each other, mostly in the academic literature, but echoes. And sometimes you fall prey to the temptation of going into the policy debate, how the two terms are used in the policy debate. And as I listen to the comments and remarks and questions in the room, this is actually what gains traction when people discuss about these. What policymakers do with these two terms, how they use it, and especially in the European Union, they've been pitted one against the other, and intra-EU migration has been framed for a long time as mobility, just to draw a line between intra and non-EU or third country immigration. So my point is, do you think these four narratives or frameworks do apply to the policy debate as well, or they're just academic heuristics? Thank you.
Thanks, Ettore. And then we have Kunmi online and also another question from Carla Regina. Kunmi, if you want to unmute yourself, yes.
Yes, good afternoon. Looking at the presentation, I have to give kudos to the presenter. But looking at the background of the presenter as a sociology, I think giving explanation to the times and what really bring out the push factors for people going into this people intending to migrate. I think it will have give more justice, like just a comment from the previous person talking about the policy, like at least addressing policymaker. I think it will more position the explanation of the networks between mobility and migration. Then as a sociology, I actually don't see the role of probably culture interaction or because I believe culture at times, as a sociology, culture at times give a shape to policymaker, like the idea of a culture being superior to another, the idea of wrong perception, the idea of stereotype. I believe all of these have one or two things to do with how we actually place migration and mobility.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Also, Carla Regina, do you want to unmute yourself and pose directly the question? Or maybe I'll just read it to Lorenzo and the audience. So Carla says that recently she wrote a thesis about the difference between migration and mobility. Migration term related to the use of the government mainly, and mobility as it has a wide spectrum. She addressed it as migratory mobility as the proposal of one of my professors, Dr. Bruno Miranda. So if we quit call it migration, people should stop being called immigrants then. Should we recategorize it? She also used the continuum to explain the journey through Mexico post-pandemic, highlighting movement, waiting, and then movement again. And she enjoys your proposal. So I'll close it here for this round, and then we'll have a last one.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Very useful comments and questions, Leo. Indeed, trend among disciplines. We have not done it, but I think it's an excellent proposal because I would expect very different trends to emerge if we were to look, for example, at, again, sociology and international relations or political economy. So I think this links very nicely to the earlier comment by Andrew. Very good suggestion. Ettore, yeah, it's the fourth time you asked me. No, I'm kidding. And I still have no answer. So no, but thanks. Ettore was such an important driving force behind this paper with a lot of excellent comments. This one, we actually have addressed it in the end in a way that maybe is not satisfactory. Initially, we're trying to surf between a paper that was meant to be for academics and also for policymakers. In the end, we try to be quite explicit in the paper that this is mainly an invitation for other academics, for scholars, for researchers, and it's we hope a useful heuristic to be used. Maybe not necessarily explicitly, but just to pay attention when different, again, categories of migration and mobility are used in the research that we produce. And this is because if we were to go in the policy work and think about what we call categories of practice and no longer categories of analysis, the discussion would be even more complex and layered. So we do hope that some people in institutions and public administration can find this useful, but this paper is mainly directed, it's mainly a plea for other researchers. And Kunmi, yes, maybe we don't pay sufficient attention to the drivers of migration in this paper, but I think of them as fitting into different interplays that we identify. Of course, the interplays are not self-exclusive, so people can use more than one at the same time. What we probably do not do so much with this framework is thinking about discrimination and stereotypes and cultural representations, because this is really focused on, again, human movement and not so much on longer term consequences of movement. And Carla, Regina, thanks a lot. I will be very curious to read your work. I think what you are suggesting is that categories of migration are mostly about the rules and the production of norms, and categories of mobility are mostly about individual experiences. And I think there is certainly a story to that, but sometimes it can be more complex. So even categories of mobility can be about cultural or societal rules that push people, for example, to move. Again, think about lorry drivers during the pandemic who were obligated to drive long distances, whereas other people were not. But yes, I'll be very happy to read what you've done, and hopefully we keep the discussion going. As for other papers that I've done, this is really an invitation for other people to engage and expand on this framework, because this is definitely not comprehensive, and there is a lot more to it, we hope.
So one last round. I saw someone in the room and also someone online, but I missed the person who raised his or her hand before. So if you want to raise your hand again, you can intervene now. Yes, please.
Thank you. Patrick Wall, I'm an independent consultant based here in Florence. Lorenzo, thank you so much. Your paper echoed in a number of ways a dispute that I used to have when I worked at UNHCR, where it's become fashionable to describe refugees as people forced to flee, which I always objected to, once on the basis that there are actually millions of people who are refugees who have never fled anywhere, and who became refugees through other methods, but also because of the focus on the mobility aspect of the refugee experience, which is obviously only one small aspect of it, rather than the much longer kind of lifetime journey of refugee experience. But thank you very much. I think the categories are very interesting and allows us to think about these two concepts in in multiple different ways. For what it's worth, I don't think that there's a problem that there aren't strict definitions of the two concepts. My understanding of the paper was much more as an attempt to unpack the uncertainty around what these two concepts are and how they relate to one another, rather than to provide a sort of an once and for all clarification of the two concepts and their relationship. So I thought that that was served actually better by not having definitions. Two questions. You mentioned that this is sort of the beginning of a discussion or a conversation, and that you hope that there's future research that's undertaken with the paper. I wonder if you had any indications or any preliminary thoughts about what directions that could take. And a second question, as a lawyer and a political scientist, the citation looks much more like a scientific paper with such a large number of authors. It's much more common for me to read papers with one, sometimes two, and very, very rarely three authors. And so I wondered if you had any reflections on the process of writing with such a large number of authors, maybe what some of the advantages and disadvantages might be, and whether we should all be thinking about writing in much larger groups than we do currently.
Thanks, Patrick. I see also Matteo from online, if you want to unmute yourself. Otherwise, I'll read your question. Okay, I think I'll read it. Matteo says, hi, thank you, Lorenzo. I'm an historian, and it seems to me that there's a growing interest of historians to utilize the mobile persons as a subject of research in long-term perspective. I wonder methodologically to what extent you might see connections between works of historians with other disciplines, such as sociology, anthropology, political science, etc. And then as a final question, I'll use my powers as chair to ask you, I had many questions and comments on this paper, but the one thing that really struck me was the similarity with other two terms that I frequently used in my work, that are integration and inclusion. And of course, I mean, this is here the integration is similar to migration in terms of you know, the you said reproducing legacies of colonialism, naturalizing the natural order of things, and also, in a sense, a narrow understanding of human settlement, in this case, not human movement. So I wonder whether, because you created this frame, these ideal types to keep using these two terms, right? And to have them one by the other. What if it becomes clear that the migration concept is more, is based and perpetuates colonial power dynamics in a sense? Shouldn't we aim to stop using this term altogether and I mean, keep studying, but also changing the term? Thank you.
Okay, very tough final round of questions. I really appreciate them, because I think they are, yeah, they provide a lot of ideas and maybe some suggestions of what to do next. Patrick, yeah, really, thanks for those recommendations. In terms of the kind of conversation we want to have, I have no idea how people will engage with this. I do hope that people will engage with this migration mobility nexus. Ideally, I think I would be very curious to see how, again, these interplays change over time, and whether there are differences. So, for example, the use of mobility was very strong in different European countries until a few years ago, and a similar use of categories of mobility is becoming very widespread in the South American context now, for example. So to see how there are also processes of diffusions regionally would be an interesting development. And the second is, I do hope that people propose different interplays that we have not considered. And I know that's difficult because it's such an abstract conversation, but maybe by doing by using research examples, it becomes easier, which brings me to the point raised by Matteo. Indeed, there is a lot of great research done by historians on, again, human movement, writ large. To me, I think of that research mostly in the interplay that we call continuum. So, for example, there is research now on people moving from Portugal to Southern European countries, and how those movements change depending on gender, on social class, and how, again, there were different temporal trends across the centuries. So that's a brilliant example, I think, and it clearly shows one specific way of using this interplay, that is just a qualitative difference in forms of movement, with some being migration, so men, in this specific case, who move permanently from Portugal to South America, and others shorter in time, so maybe mobile individuals, mainly women who then return to the country. Leila, I don't know. I conduct research on migration, so maybe I would be reluctant to the idea of getting rid of the term altogether. I also cannot find any satisfactory alternative, and I do think that what is important to do is to recognize the often nefarious consequences of colonialism rather than getting rid of the term altogether and pretending that those consequences do not exist. But there are a lot more people that are better placed to answer the question than I am. There was one outstanding question from Patrick. How is it to write with many co-authors? I wanted to check if any of my co-authors is online. No, it was a great experience. I think the paper is way too abstract at times, but that is also because it really tries to speak to different audiences. And some of the co-authors are sociologists, other are political theorists, other are comparative political scholars. So it was very challenging at times, but sitting around the table and try to think of those terms together was such an experience, because we did realize that we start from completely different premises when it comes to what is that we want to observe and what we consider as migration and mobility. And we hope that the paper reflects that kind of pluralism and really tells people it is obviously fine to have different definitions, but maybe sometimes we should make a bit of an effort in trying to be extremely clear about, again, the boundaries of the definition we use and the ways in which they can relate to each other. I'm not sure we succeeded, but we do invite other people to continue in the struggle.
Thank you, Lorenzo, and thank you all from here, the audience from here and online. You'll find the recording of this webinar series on our MPC YouTube channel. And thank you again.